Hello and welcome. My name is Victor Gijsbers and I teach philosophy at Leiden University in the Netherlands. In this video, I will not take a look at a strictly speaking philosophical text, but I will be taking a look at a short story written by Borges. Now, Borges is one of the great authors of the 20th century, and if you have not read this story, The Immortal, I highly recommend that you pause this video, go and read The Immortal, which can be found free on the internet very easily. It's quite short, it's maybe 10 pages or so. Read that first and then return to the video, because I am going to spoil everything, or at least almost everything. So check out the story before watching the video. Now, the reason that I want to talk about a literary story is that it fits very neatly within the theme of immortality that I have been exploring. We did a video on Thomas Nagel's article about death. We did a video on Bernard Williams's article about the tedium of immortality. And I will soon make and publish another video on Martha Nussbaum's thinking about immortality in Lucretius and Epicurus. So, what happens in the Borges story is that a Roman military commander who has failed to win glory in battle searches out the city of the Immortals in order to win some fame and glory for himself. Right, and already we have there this theme of immortality. Right, I mean, trying to get fame and glory, that's basically a way of trying to become immortal in a figurative sense. But of course, if you find the actual city of the Immortals, you might become immortal in a literal sense. Now, it's a terrible journey, and at the end of it, half dead, our Roman commander finds himself face to face with the city of the Immortals, which is a huge big city on a plateau on the other side of a little stream. And he is too weak to go there immediately. And where he is at the stream, there is also a small group of what he calls troglodytes. Well, they're people, but in a sense barely so. They don't talk, they don't seem to even acknowledge his existence. They just drink the water from the stream and eat serpent's flesh, and they appear to exist in a state which is hardly living at all. Right? They have no interaction with each other. They're just there, sitting, lying down, staring into the distance, and now and then maybe drinking and eating a little, and that's it. Okay, at some point, he has strength enough to attempt to get into the city. And that turns out to be more difficult than you might expect, because the city doesn't have any real entrance. There's just a cave underneath the city, which leads to a labyrinth. And so the military commander goes through this labyrinth and finally is able to ascend into the city. It's a city, he says, it's so vast, it's so magnificent, a city that is built by the gods. But as he walks around, he amends that to gods who have died. No, gods who went mad. Because it's a mad city. Nothing makes sense. Right? Giant doors open up onto little cells, staircases go up and then end in nothingness, and so on and so forth. It is basically an H.P. Lovecraft story, except that he nowhere uses the phrase non-Euclidean geometry. Okay, so this mad city is something that he flees. There's also nobody there, by the way, it's completely deserted. This mad city is something that he flees, and he gets back among these troglodytes. And then, one day in this desert, there is suddenly rain. And suddenly these troglodytes, they sort of apparently feel that they are alive, with the rain streaming down their faces. And the military commander talks to one of them, and he calls them by a name, the name of a character, actually of a trusty dog, in Homer's Odyssey. He says, Argos, Argos. And then this guy who he talks to, whom he thought wasn't even able to use language, turns out to know the Odyssey, and turns out to be able to use phrases from the Odyssey. And when he says, wow, you know the Odyssey, the guy says, well, you know, and I'll read this out. He says, I don't know much about it. I mean, even the worst singer knows more of the Odyssey than I do, because it has been 1100 years since I last wrote it. It has been 1100 years since I last wrote it. So two things are going on there in that sentence. One, it turns out that this troglodyte is actually Homer, the ancient Greek writer of epics. On the other hand, it's the weird phrase, since I last wrote it, that should get our attention. Okay, so what turns out to be the case? Well, it's these troglodytes, right? These people who are just sitting there, staring there, lying down, doing nothing, having no communication among each other. Those are the Immortals. And they used to live in the city of the Immortals, but they sort of came to understand its futility. They came to understand that immortality is not a blessing, that it is a curse. And so they broke down their city and they built it up in this mad way as a kind of testament to the irrationality or the non-making sense or maybe the horribleness of existence. Okay, so why is immortality, according to this Borges story, not a blessing but a curse? Well, I want to read you a few passages from section 4, which is really the sort of central, like philosophically speaking, the central section here. So here's what he writes. There is nothing very remarkable about being immortal. With the exception of mankind, all creatures are immortal, for they know nothing of death. What is divine, terrible, and incomprehensible is to know oneself immortal. And then he goes on to say that, look, you might think that a lot of people know themselves to be immortal, or at least believe themselves to be immortal, because it's a central part of a lot of religions that you are immortal. But he says, I don't believe it. Like, those people don't really believe that they are immortal. When you look at the way that almost every Christian, almost every Muslim, almost everyone from religions that believe in immortality, when you see how they actually live, they put all the emphasis on the life here and now. And really, almost the only conception that they have of an eternal afterlife is that it's going to be some kind of reward or punishment for this life now, right? This life now is the one that has all the importance, and the life afterwards, it's just a sort of thing that stems from, that follows on this life here and now, and they don't even have a very clear conception of what it's going to be like. Well, that's something that we saw in Bernard Williams's paper as well, right? Bernard Williams was looking at that and saying, okay, so what is this conception of the afterlife that you might have? Like, people think that maybe it's eternal contemplation of God, but what's that, right? And how would that be fulfilling? And it's very hard to sort of give any real content to that, because the real content that we know from our lives involves, embarking on projects that might succeed or fail, living this life with its mixture of hope and disappointment and fulfillment and joy and anger and sadness and so on and so forth, which can't be what this eternally blessed afterlife is like at all. But then what is it like, right? There's basically no conception there. Okay, for Borges, this is just a few sentences. We saw it more extensively in Williams, and we will see a variation on that in Nussbaum. Nussbaum is going to be extremely interested in the idea that all the values that we know and recognize are essentially mortal values. So we'll get back to that in another video. Okay, so the insight that the Immortals got into immortality after living for a couple of centuries is this. They knew that over an infinitely long span of time, all things happen to all men. Right? If you live for infinite time, everything is going to happen to you. You are going to do everything that can be done, suffer everything that can be suffered, And I suppose you're not only going to do and suffer it once, but you're going to do and suffer it again and again and again. And so it makes sense for Homer to say, well, it has been 1100 years since last I wrote the Odyssey, because it is a necessary feature of immortality, one might think, that you will write the Odyssey at some point. Here's what Borges writes. Homer composed the Odyssey. Given infinite time with infinite circumstances and changes, it is impossible that the Odyssey should not be composed at least once. And I suppose that in fact it would be impossible for it not to be composed infinitely many times. Right? And so you are going to do everything that can be done and suffer everything that can be suffered. And that means, and this is the second crucial insight, that there is really no distinction between people. So here's what Borges writes in the next sentence. Like Cornelius Agrippa, I am God, hero, philosopher, demon, and world, which is a long-winded way of saying that I am not. And I actually skipped a sentence where he says, no one is someone, a single immortal man is all man. Right? So there is no individuality anymore in this state of immortality. Everyone is everyone, because everyone is going to do everything that can be done. And that's it. Right? I mean, there might be distinctions in the order in which you do things or something like that, but that seems to be completely unimportant. So the entire idea of selfhood, individuality, is sort of gone and taken away. Homer, by the way, is a perfect character for this story, because Homer is someone who on the one hand is immortal because of the two books that he wrote, the Iliad and the Odyssey, and maybe also others that have disappeared, so he's not immortal because of those, but the Iliad and the Odyssey. But also it is completely unclear whether Homer was a real person, whether he was a single person, whether he is just a conventional name for an entire tradition of nameless bards working on these texts, we don't know. Right? So this disappearance of the subject, of the individual, Homer is a sort of emblem of that. Borges, of course, knows all of this and chooses Homer because of these facts. So let me read out one more thing. This is at the very end of section 4. Death, or reference to death, makes men precious and pathetic. Their ghostliness is touching. Any act they perform may be their last. There is no face that is not on the verge of blurring and fading away like the faces in a dream. Everything in the world of mortals has the value of the irrecoverable and contingent. So to be contingent is to be not necessary, right? In the mortal life, things are contingent. They happen, but they could also not have happened. And so there is a certain value to the fact that they happen. A positive value, or maybe a negative value, depending on what it is that happens. But in an immortal life, everything is going to happen. Nothing is contingent. And that something happens is just necessity playing itself out over and over again. Okay, let's return to the text. Among the immortals, on the other hand, every act, every thought is the echo of others that preceded it in the past, with no visible beginning, and a faithful presage of others that will repeat it in the future. Ad vertiginem. Ad vertigine. Yeah, well, okay. Ad vertiginem. That's, I think, until you're sort of vertigus, nauseous from it. There is nothing that is not as though lost between indefatigable mirrors. Nothing can occur but once. Nothing is preciously in peril of being lost. So the idea here is that the very mortality, contingency, and getting lostness of things, that is part of their value. In an immortal life, that is all taken away. And what is left is the kind of state where people, the troglodytes, are just going to sort of sit down and do nothing. Right? And a part of the story even tells about a man who falls into a pit and sits there for 70 years before one of the other troglodytes thinks, oh, let's throw him a rope. And he doesn't even really notice or mind it. Right? He's just there for 70 years in that dark pit with no food or drink, sort of thinking, doing essentially nothing, because value, urgency, but even more fundamentally, value has disappeared. So, Borges agrees, I would say, with Bernard Williams, but not on for precisely the same reasons. Right? Bernard Williams told us that immortality is not a blessing because it's going to become very boring once you have exhausted the possibilities. Now, Borges is kind of saying that, but these people haven't even exhausted the possibilities yet. They have understood, right? They have seen through their insight into their own condition that if everything is necessary and infinitely repeating, nothing has value. And so they lose all interest in things because nothing has value. It is the structure of mortality itself, its ephemeralness, its contingency, that gives value to the events of our lives.